Good morning. Welcome to Tim Bridge Church. My name is Nick, and my wife Jo and I are the lead pastors here. We're honored that you would take time out of your weekend to come and to hang out with us. And we're in the middle of a series called The Busy Marriage. And so we kicked it off last week, and it's all about relationships and how busyness impacts those relationships and what we can do about that. And so if you're here and you're not married, please don't think, hey, there's nothing here today for me, because really at the core of this, we're using the lens of marriage to talk about relationships. And so it's all about relationships, but for those of us who are married, we're looking at it through that lens. And we kicked things off last week. We talked about how busyness is the enemy of deep relationships, that being busy actually keeps our relationships and our marriages on a very shallow level, because busyness is the enemy of intimacy and connection. And if we're not careful, we get so busy that we don't connect in our marriages and we don't connect in our relationships. And so we're going to continue that series today. Yesterday, my son Hayden, who's a junior higher at Henderson, we got to spend a couple hours in the car together driving back from Dallas, and we had some really good conversations. And we're talking today about communication. So we had some really good conversations, and one of those conversations we had was about communication, and was about how you talk and the words you use. And basically he gave me a great lesson on all the current and modern slang. Things like drip, which if you've never heard that has to do with how you dress and what you look like and how your outfit is put together. And your ice, if you got nice ice, you probably have a nice necklace or jewelry or something like that. These two young guys are laughing at me because they're like, he's butchering it already. They know I was gonna talk about. He said he taught me how to use the word bussin' in a sentence, right? And if you say no cap, that means you're really serious. You're not lying. So church is going to be great this morning. No cap. And then he also taught me how to use the phrase, it hits different. And so I was like, okay, I was going to try to impress him. So I actually wrote this down because I knew I'd forget it, but I was going to impress him. I tried to put all the words he taught me in one sentence. I was like, you should have seen my drip and ice when I went to Texas Roadhouse. It was bussin', no cap. And that steak at Texas Roadhouse just hits different. To which my 13-year-old goes, Dad, don't. And then he looked at me dead serious, like, seriously? Don't do that in public. And so then afterwards, about 3-4 hours after we got back to Stephenville, he came in and he said, hey, Dad, just so you know, if you really want to try to use the words that we use, if you want to speak the language we speak, there's videos on YouTube that help old parents know how to do that. And so I was a little offended. But here's the thing, when it comes to communication, far too many of us in our most important relationships, especially in our marriage, we take Hayden's advice. We just don't. When it comes to communication, in our most important relationships, too many times we just don't. We just don't communicate. And a lot of the time, the reason for that is that we're just so stinking busy. We got jobs and we got hobbies and we got work commitments and school commitments and kid commitments and sports teams and dance teams and extracurricular activities and homework assignments. And it's hard to communicate with people that you never sit down and have face-to-face time with. But communication is vital to a healthy marriage. Communication is vital to healthy relationships. If our relationships are going to be strong, they're only going to be as strong as our communication. The Bible teaches that. The Bible knows this truth well. In fact, if you have a Bible, open it up to James chapter 1. It's in the New Testament. That's where we're going to be starting out today, in James chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible or don't have the Bible app on your mobile device, no need to panic. You can follow along on the screens behind me. All the verses will be there today. But if you're new to church or new to the Bible's divided up into two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is a record of the history and movement of God before the coming of His Son Jesus into the world. And everything in the Old Testament points forth for, that one day God will send a rescuer to rescue people from their sins. The New Testament is the story of the rescuer, the Messiah, the Son of God. His name is Jesus, and the New Testament records his birth, his life, his death on a cross, his resurrection. That means he came back to life in the beginnings of his early church. And we're going to start off in the book of James, written by James, the brother of Jesus. And here's what he says in James 1:19. He says, "Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry." Now, when we think of communication, typically we think of talking because we want to be the one doing all the talking. But most of communication is listening. It's actually connecting. And what the Bible says is that we should be quick to communicate. That we should be quick to communicate. We should be willing to make time and create time to listen to the people that we care the most about. But how do you do that if your life is overly busy? How do you do that if your schedule is so full that you never have face time with the people that you care the most about? That if you're like two ships passing in the night and you've got so many things going on in your life that you just don't feel like you have time to communicate. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to give you two keys, two communication keys for busy people. Two communication keys for busy people. The first one is this. It's important to understand, it's important to know that rushed communication is typically rude communication. Think about the last time you tried to have a conversation with someone that was important, but you felt like you were rushed. Like you had somewhere to be, they had somewhere to be. It was probably short. It was probably a little bit of irritability involved in the conversation. It probably wasn't the kindest conversation that you had, right? Why? Because when we're rushed and we have rushed communication, that typically ends up being rude communication. When we're busy and our conversations are rushed, when our patience is rushed, when we're busy and distracted as listeners, when we're busy and we don't have time to talk and time to listen. And sometimes we're busy with like legit important stuff. Maybe you're married and you work at home, and so you've got a work deadline, and you're working at home, you're working on this work deadline, and you're trying to meet this deadline, and your spouse comes up to you, and they're trying to get your attention, they're trying to get your attention, they're trying to get your attention, and finally that you're like, what do you want, right? And that conversation doesn't go as you hoped it would go because you were really busy with some important, legit stuff. But a lot of the times, what we're busy with isn't really that important, if we're honest. Like you're sitting at home and you've fallen into the trap of the doom scroll and you're just scrolling on social media, right? And now you're enthralled with what that latest viral TikTok video is, or you're so invested in what your friend from high school that you haven't seen in 17 years had for lunch and what they posted on Facebook and Instagram, right? And you're just so invested, and your spouse has to say your name 7 or 8 times in order to get your attention, and then you're both irritated because those tacos that they had for lunch was really important to you, that you found that out. And they're mad because they said your name 6 or 7 times to get you to look up from your phone. You see, a lot of times we're busy with stuff that really just isn't that important. And so the busier we are, even whether it's important stuff or unimportant stuff, in our effort to keep the ball moving, to go, our communication can become rushed and rude. And the base of that is anger and anxiety, because that's what busyness creates. If you look at any good sociologist, any good psychiatrist will tell you that the busier you are, the better chance of a foundation of anger and or anxiety in your life. Because we weren't created to live without margin. And when we live without margin, it leads to either anger in our life or it leads to anxiety in our life. And then our relational connection and communication with people flows out of that anger and that anxiety. Proverbs 29:11 says, "Fools vent their anger, but the wise quietly hold it back." This one's pretty simple to understand. When we let our anger control our conversations because of how rushed we are, and our conversations turn rude because they're rushed, then we are acting foolish. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26 in the New Testament, Paul, a follower of Jesus, writes these words. He says, "In your anger, do not sin. In your anger, do not sin. Now, we get that, right? We understand what that means. We think we do. We go, oh, okay, well, that means don't get so angry that you murder somebody, because that would be a sin. Like, don't get so angry that you have such road rage that you run somebody off the road and shoot them the finger while you drive by, right? Because that would be sinful. Some of you are like, oh, that's sinful. I don't need to do that anymore. Don't get so angry that you get violent with someone, because that would be sinful. Like, we get that, right? But actually, if we read it in context, we may not get it as much as we do, as we think we do. Because what Paul is talking about before verse 26 and after verse 26 is communication. Look at what verse 25 says. He says, therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. He's talking about how you talk to one another. And then look at the verses after it in verse 29. Don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what's helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. So Paul is saying, listen, when it comes to how you communicate with people, when it comes to how you talk with people, be sure that you're using your words to build people up. Be sure you're speaking truthfully. Be sure you're communicating in a positive way. Be sure the people, especially the people closest to you, like our spouses, our significant others, be sure you don't communicate in a rude and angry way, because when you do that, you are letting anger control you, and that anger is leading to sin. So when Paul says, in your anger, do not sin, he's not talking about in your anger, don't get road rage and run somebody off the road. He's saying when you get angry, because you're busy or frustrated or irritable in your communication with the people you love, don't be sinful. Why? Because rushed communication typically is rude communication. So here's a hard question for us to ask. Here's a question for us to ask ourselves. When we're busy, does the way we talk to our spouse build them up or tear them down? When we're busy, when we talk to the people closest to us, our spouse, our significant other, our kids, our close friends, do our words build them up or tear them down? Rushed communication is typically rude communication. Proverbs 15:28 says this, the heart of the godly thinks carefully before speaking. The mouth of the wicked overflows with evil words. Proverbs says that godly people, people with godly hearts who want to honor God with their lives, what they do is they have the time to think carefully before they speak. But wicked people just fire off words, rushed words, rude words, unkind words that can become hurtful and evil. So if we do a little honest self-evaluation here today, when it comes to being overly busy, having schedules that are too full and lives that are too busy, do we honestly think we have the time to think carefully before we speak? Or are we more reactionary when it comes to our communication with our spouses, with the person we're dating, with our kids? We have to slow down to carefully communicate with kindness in our relationships, because rushed communication is rude communication. Here's the second key. It's this. Number 2, take the time to talk. In your most important relationships, especially in marriage, you have to take the time to talk. Now, notice I didn't say make the time to talk, because you know what you and I can't do? We can't make time. We can't create time. We're all given the same 24/7, 365, and when it is done, it is done. We can't make any more. We can't create anymore. We can't dream up any more time. We all have the same amount of time. So what we have to do is not make time. We have to take the time that we've been given and be sure that communication in our most important relationships becomes a priority. Now listen, I want to kind of hit a pause button here and talk to the people that are dating. If you're dating someone and you're thinking, you know what we need to do? We don't communicate very well. So you know what we need to do? We need to get married. And if we were married, we would communicate better. all the married people were like, can I laugh out loud at that or not? If we just got married, we would communicate better. No, that's not going to solve anything. In fact, when you get married, what typically happens is you communicate less. You communicate less. And there's a lot of factors because of that, but one of them is a psychological factor called the gotcha factor. That's not the psychological term, but that's what I call it. I gotcha, so we're good, right? And we talked about that stuff before we were married. I told you I loved you before we were married, and that's sometimes how we think. And communication has to be a priority. We have to take the time we've been given and prioritize communicating with our spouse. Titus chapter 2, verse 11 through 12 says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions." Here's what he's saying. It teaches us to say no to living the exact way the world lives. It teaches us to say no to doing life the exact way the worldly culture does life, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. What does it mean to be self-controlled? It means that you have your priorities right. It means that you don't let your schedule drive you, but you drive your schedule and say, communication in my relationship is important, so I'm going to be sure that I take the time, that I set the priority to make sure communication happens. Proverbs 12:18 says, "The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." Why is it so important that we carve out time to communicate and really talk and connect in our most important relationships and relationships like marriage? Because wise communication brings healing to our relationships. Reckless, thoughtless, quick, and careless words cause damage in those relationships. But wise communication brings healing. That's why Paul says this in Ephesians 4:29. We read it earlier. "Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them." You see, when it comes to healthy communication in our relationships, it's not just that we talk, it's how we talk. It's not just that we take the time to talk, but it's how we talk to one another. That's why we have to make communication a priority. That's why we can't be so busy that we never have time to talk with our spouse. That's why if you have a relationship, and maybe it's not even a marriage relationship, but it's a relationship that you feel strongly about, that you feel is a strong relationship, and you actually get so busy that you don't have time to communicate, you don't take the time to talk, that's why that will always be detrimental to your relationships. Because where there is a lack of communication, there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of understanding, there's a lack of met and unmet expectations, there's a lack of connection, and that always deteriorates relationships. Proverbs 18:21 says, "The tongue can bring death or life." Our words, both what we say, how we say it, and how often we're able to communicate, it either brings life into our relationships, or it either kills our relationships. That's why it's so vital that we take time to talk in our marriages. I want you to think about that for a second. What we say, how we say it, and how often we say it is either doing one of two things. It is either bringing life into our relationship, or it is literally killing our relationship. So if we look at our communication, and the busier we get, typically the worse we are at communication. For a number of reasons. We don't have the time to communicate. We feel like we're too busy to communicate. We don't have, when we do communicate, we don't have the patience with one another because we feel like we're so busy and stretched so thin. The busier we are, the more irritable and unkind we are, and that flows into our communication as well. And so when we think about our relationships, when we think about our marriages, what we say, how we say it, and how often we say it is either pouring water onto a growing, thriving plant, or it's literally ripping up at the plant by its roots. It's either bringing life or bringing death. There's no middle ground. Our words to our spouses, to our kids, to our friends, they either bring life or they bring death. Healthy communication is relationship CPR. That's what it is. In fact, if you're like, man, I feel like our marriage is in a rough place, you know what the best thing you could do for your marriage is? The absolute best thing you could do is to say, hey, moving forward, we're going to take time every single day to just talk, whether that's 10 minutes, whether that's 15 minutes. We're going to talk together, and then we're going to pray together. We're going to talk to God together. We're going to communicate together, and we're going to communicate with God. And I guarantee you there are other things you can do that will help your marriage, but I guarantee you, here's the 100% truth. That won't hurt your marriage. It won't hurt your relationship. If you sit down and go, you know what, I feel like our relationship needs to go to the next level, let's take time regularly, consistently to talk and to talk to God together, to talk and to pray together. Even if it's a small amount of time, it will be CPR to your relationship. What we say, it's either bringing life or death. So is it kind and calm, or is it rude and rushed? How we say it, it's either bringing life or bringing death. So is it carefully thought out or quickly spouted out? How often we say it, it's either bringing life or it's bringing death. So are we making margin to communicate with those we love, or are we so busy that we never take the time to talk? We got to take the time to talk, because our communication can bring life and death into our marriage and our relationships. So in 2016, the Journal of Consumer Research released a study, and it was actually quite profound, but swept under the rug by most of us in our society. It didn't get a lot of traction, but basically what they said is they did a study of Americans, and they said in America, a busy and overworked lifestyle has actually become more of a desired status symbol than a wealthy or leisurely lifestyle. That now we live in a society in America where busyness is worn as such a badge of honor, where decades ago, status would be found in wealth, or status would be found in possessions, how big of a house you had, what kind of job you had, what kind of car you have. That we no longer live in a society that looks at status that way. We look at status based on how busy and overly scheduled somebody's life is. And the busier you are and the more overly scheduled you are, we in our minds equate that with the more important you are. Here's what the research found out. Our research indicates that an individual's perceived level of busyness is heavily connected to their self-worth, as well as how others view their status. Individuals who are busy by choice may feel needed, in demand, and important, thus elevating their feelings of self-worth. Culturally, there has been a shift in status perception, and that material objects and goods are no longer the indicator of one's social standing. Now, individuals who are busy at work are overworked and have a real lack of leisure time are perceived as the highest social status. So you know what that means? We get so busy trying to fill our cup, our life, with being important, that busyness is actually choking out the relationships that we value most. It's almost like all of us have a cup, but our culture has drilled a huge hole in the bottom of the cup. And so we run around trying to be busy so we can find value and worth. And we think, well, if our kids do this, then we'll fit in, and then we'll measure up, and then we'll be just like the Joneses. And we run over there, but what we realize is that busyness has created such a relational void that we pour all of that stuff into our calendar, and it doesn't fill our life. It just goes right out the bottom. And so then we go over here and we go, well, I must need to do more at work. And if I did more at work, they'd probably realize how valuable I am. And so I'll just work more, and that's where I'll find my value and worth. And we run over here and we pour all that extra time for work. And guess what? There's a hole in the bottom of the cup, and it just goes out and it doesn't fill us. It doesn't give us value and worth. And we think, well, if I just did this, and our kids did that, and we better join that league, and we better have this on the weekends. And man, everybody else seems to be going on Saturdays. We can't stay at home and just spend time as a family. Everybody else, they're too busy for date night. We can't have a date night every week. And so we think we have to be busy And we're literally like cups with a hole in the bottom, just running from activity to activity, hoping that we will get some kind of status, some kind of worth, some kind of value. Here's what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16 through 19. He says, I pray that from his glorious, unlimited resources, he will empower you with inner strength through his Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust him. And your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. May you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it's too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete with all fullness of life and power that comes from God. You see, when it comes to our communication, and it comes to our relationships, if we could understand what Jesus communicates to us and what Jesus communicates about us, then our cups would already be full. And we wouldn't be trying to validate our lives with this overly hectic, super busy life that we want to live in American society. And we could say, man, my life is full because my value and worth is in Jesus, and I'm just going to use my words, I'm just going to use my time, I'm just going to communicate in such a way that I take what Jesus has poured into me and I just pour it into the cup of my spouse. And when I communicate with my kids, I'm going to take what Jesus has filled my cup with, and I'm just going to pour it into the cup of my kids. And I'm not going to let our family run around and go from activity to activity, thing to thing, being so busy that we don't even know each other because we never communicate. I'm going to find my value and worth in Jesus. And when I understand what Jesus communicates about me, it changes how I communicate here. And so at the foundation of our busyness is the fact that we have somehow misunderstood what the King of Kings and Lord of Lords thinks about us. And we think that we have to get our value in our busyness, that we have to get our worth in constantly going. But if we could understand that our value and worth is found in Jesus, if we could get what Paul says when he says, I pray that you would be able to understand how wide and how tall and how long and how deep the love of Christ is. Because if you could get that, if you could get this, then it changes all of this. It changes all of this, because now I'm not so busy trying to find my value. My value is in Jesus. I'm not looking to my spouse to pour out of their empty cup into my empty cup, because our value is in Jesus, and we can connect and we can communicate and we can build one another up because we already know where our value is found. And so we have to take the time to talk. We have to make sure that our communication is rushed. But more than all of that, we have to make sure that our value and worth isn't dictated in how fast society says that we have to live, but that our value and worth as a couple, as individuals, as a family is found in who Jesus says we are. Because if I can understand my worth in Jesus, and he's downloaded that to me, I understand what he's communicated to me, and that transforms how I communicate to those around me. And I'm no longer running around with my cup with a hole cut in the bottom saying, I've got to find my value in this culture. And I say, no, God's already given my value to me. I just got to share it with others and fill their cups. Let's pray. As we bow our heads and pray together, maybe you're here today and you've never found your value in Jesus. There's never been a time where you've said yes to a relationship with Jesus, but you want to do that today. I want to give you the opportunity to do that. I want to lead you through a prayer. There's nothing special or magical about the words or phrases we use. What matters is the commitment of your heart and your mind to the person of Jesus. So if you're ready to say yes to a relationship with Jesus, right where you're seated, you can pray something like this. Dear Jesus, today I say yes to you. Today I place my trust in you. I ask you to forgive me of my sins and to fill my life with your hope and your love. Today, Jesus, I make you the leader and Lord of my life. Help me to find my value in you and you alone. Help me to live your word.